Hello, gathered friends, I'm Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. This video is part of the Bionicle Day Special for 2023. Happy 8/10, everybody! In keeping with this year's theme of being the 20th anniversary of the 2003 story year, I've decided this deep dive to analyze the Bohrok-Kal Arc, and specifically how it handles the "my powers are gone" trope, to produce some very interesting character development for the Tahu. This video was heavily inspired by one from Overly Sarcastic Productions, where Red does a really great job of covering this trope in general. Let's dive right into it. Now, many in the Bionicle community consider the 2003 Bohrok-Kal Arc as some of the closest Bionicle gets to having a filler arc, and in some ways they're right. The sets were clone sets of clone sets, and the story didn't really push the overarching plot of the series forward, since the Toa weren't making significant progress to reawaken Matanui or to uncover the larger mysteries of the island. It's extremely likely that the whole thing was made to pad out time until the big movie Mask of Light would be ready for the second half of that year's story. However, I assert that it is not truly filler that can be skipped over, but an important and worthy addition to the Bionicle story, mainly because it provided a tremendous amount of interesting and much needed character development for the Toa, all of which is facilitated by the power loss trope. This arc is very well written in terms of its thematic consistency. It's about a lesson in power, the dangers of arrogance and lack of control, and how true strength comes from using their minds and working together. Now, in OSP's analysis of this trope, Red talks about how the powers are gone trope is usually an episodic type plot, where the loss of power is treated as a disruption to the status quo. Characters who usually have fantastic powers that let them solve all sorts of problems are now stuck in a situation where they don't have those powers anymore. It's often a good way to raise the stakes and force the heroes to get creative in how they deal with the problems that would have been way easier a moment before. Usually it's a sort of shake-up episode where the heroes have to deal with an unusual problem before eventually getting their powers back and things returning to normal. And this format is what we see in the Bohrok-Kal Arc. The heroes lose their powers due to the villains stealing them and have to find a way to win without them, and get their powers back at the end. This arc picks up right at the end of the previous one, the Bohrok arc, where after their victory the Toa were plunged into the mysterious and powerful substance of energized protodermis, and were transformed into new, more powerful heroes, the Toa. As Toa, they had new tools, better armor, more powerful masks, and, notably, much stronger elemental abilities than ever before. While testing out their new abilities, they began sparring with each other, but briefly lose control of their tempers and almost end up hurting each other, with Tahu and Kopaka almost coming to blows. Their gargantuan egos led them to start power tripping, and the Toa decide that they don't need each other anymore and go their separate ways. They began basing their identities solely in their physical powers, and turned their back on the unity and ingenuity that actually earned them their past victories. But what they didn't realize is that their new powers were tied to their Nuva symbols, which were then stolen by the Bohrok-Kal in an effort to free the Bohrok's queens. With their symbols stolen, they lose their elemental powers. Now left weak and vulnerable, a complete crash from the highs of strength that the Toa were feeling earlier. They then spend the majority of the arc trying to find ways to fight or overpower the Kal, only to be utterly defeated at every turn. Their power led them to arrogance, which led to a lack of control, which led to defeat and humiliation. A karmic punishment for their lack of control. Something that really drives home the tension in this arc is the power of the Bohrok-Kal, who are some of the strongest foes the Toa have faced up until this point. While many Powers Are Gone storylines rely on the heroes trying to deal with problems that would be easy if they had their powers, it's pretty clear that the Bohrok-Kal would still be incredibly dangerous foes even if the Toa were at full strength. Without their powers, the heroes are forced to confront real hopelessness for the first time. This is by far the closest the Toa have ever come to losing everything. If they fail, the Bohrok swarms and their queens will be reawakened, and will resume their mission to wipe the island clean. Even at the height of their powers, they couldn't beat back the swarms, and could only barely squeak out a victory against the queens, meaning that if the Bohrok truly came back while they were powerless, the island and all their people were truly doomed. Now, what's really interesting about this arc, from a writing perspective, is the timing of it. I mean, at the end of 2002, LEGO spent a lot of time building up how cool and powerful and invincible the Toa Nuva were, only to spend the next arc depicting them powerless and humiliated. No matter what your opinion of the arc is, you have to admit it was a very bold choice by the story team to have the very first thing that happens after the heroes gain fantastic new powers is for them to immediately lose them. To be honest, I kind of respect that subversion of expectations, especially since it led to interesting and thematically appropriate character development from the Toa. They sucker punched us with this plot, but they had a real point to it, to show both the audience and the Toa that there's much more to being a hero than having powers. Being a hero requires true courage, creativity, and a willingness to understand others. While they do spend most of the arc losing, it is notable that the heroes had several near successes when they focused less on power and more on strategy and unity. Tahu and Liwa managed to overtax Nuvak-Kal's power and force it to retreat with the help of the Lematorn. Jaller manages to snatch Bohrok-Kal's Krana when it was distracted by gloating, and the Toa Nuva and Vakama managed to trap the Rahi Nui by coordinating and outthinking it. Just to name a few examples. Each of these minor victories show the theme of power isn't everything, and that the weak can overcome the strong if they work together and use their creativity. Some of the most interesting character interactions in this arc are the ones between the Toa and their Turaga. As the Turaga try to counsel the Toa on the fact that their elemental powers were not the source of their strength, and were not what makes them heroes, with these instances actually being the first definitive foreshadowing that the Turaga were former Toa themselves that gave up their powers. The main difference between them is that, while the Toa Nuva's power loss was temporary and a fixable circumstance brought on by their own arrogance, the Toa Metru's was permanent, and they did so of their own choice to fulfill their destiny. And depending on how you choose to view destiny, that meant the power loss was either inevitable, or at the very least, the best case scenario ending for them. As such, the Turaga have much more grounded and accepting view of their loss of power, because through their journeys they grew to understand that their power was less of an intrinsic part of them, but rather was a gift meant to help them in their greater purpose, and that they would eventually have to give up and pass on to the new generation in the cycle of heroes. This arc also highlights another key difference between the Toa Nuva and Toa Metru, which is that, while the Toa Metru were Matoran who transformed, the Toa Nuva came into being as Toa. They have no memory of any kind of life without their powers, and without them, they're thrown into a full existential crisis of identity. Gali, in particular, takes it hard, because with the loss of her water powers, she also loses the connection she had to the rivers and oceans around Motunui. Used to being able to feel the flow of the natural world around her, Gali laments that she feels as if she has suddenly gone deaf to an important way that she perceives the world around her. When Gali first loses her powers, she vents to Nokama about it, saying that Nokama has no idea what this feels like. Yes. I have absolutely no idea what that would feel like. Losing your elemental powers. Yep. Can't relate at all. Nokama then teaches Gali a lesson about perspective, and how there's so much more going on than there appears on the surface. A lesson that causes Gali to reflect and renew her efforts to bring the Toa back together. Onua and Wenua have a conversation about power while journeying through the underground tunnels. The whole time, Onua is focused on power in the physical sense, such as his elemental and mask powers, while Wenua is trying to get him to see the bigger picture, that those powers are meaningless without the wisdom to use them properly. Onua at one point bitterly comments on how he has to flee from creatures that he could have made short work of, and Wenua, aghast, chastises him for believing that what it means to be a Toa is to be able to defeat all that oppose you. He tries to impress upon Onua that being a hero is not about having power, that anybody can have power and use it improperly. Rather, being a true hero is about his mind and his heart. Pohatu actually uses a lesson Anawa teaches him, to knock over a pile of rocks while trying to unblock a cave-in with Kopaka. The rocks were piled in a way that they each supported each other, making it impossible to knock them all down. But Pohatu starts by carefully observing the pile and listening to the rocks, paying attention not to the individual stones, but how they supported each other. he eventually managed to find a weak point where one stone supported the rest and kicked it out, dislodging it enough that it couldn't support the rest while the whole wall collapsed. Plato explained to Kopaka that what Anawa taught him is that since each stone supports the others, if they can't work together, they can't complete the task, and finding a weak point in their unity will cause them to collapse. This ends up being a metaphor for the Toa, as their true strength comes from their ability to work together and complement each other's strengths and weaknesses, as without their unity, they were left vulnerable. It also shows the lesson of how the Toa's minds are much more important than their powers. Contrast this to earlier in their arc, where Pohatsu tried to kick down a different large cave-in, and without his powers, he only managed to hurt his foot. Anawa essentially taught him how a better understanding of the stone allows him to find ways to use his element, despite losing his power over it. And also, Anawa teaches him that it's easy to be a hero when you have tons of power, but it's much harder when all you have is your wits. But by far the most interesting dynamic between the Toa and Turaga in this arc comes from Tahu and Vakama, with Vakama giving Tahu the Mask of Time at the beginning of this arc, and Tahu struggles to come to terms with the responsibility this ultimate power brings. See, the Mask of Time throws such an interesting angle into this arc's exploration of themes of power, because now Tahu is stuck in this place of being completely powerless, but also having access to more power than he can handle. He spends a lot of this arc agonizing over this internally, because he was told to keep the mask a secret. Vakama initially refused to even let Tahu touch the mask until he was sure Tahu grasped the seriousness and scope of its power, and that it was not to be used lightly. Now, Tahu had always struggled with self-control and using his powers in recklessly destructive ways, and his transformation into a Toa Nuva only made him more arrogant about his powers. And after losing his powers, Tahu's mental state is thrown into a complete frenzy, with him being even angrier and more impulsive than usual to compensate for how vulnerable he feels. He can barely control himself, and now he's asked to be responsible for controlling time. Of all masks, the Vahi requires the most control and discipline to use. Its power affects time itself, a fundamental aspect of reality, and if one were to lose control while wielding it, time itself could be undone. During a fight with Bohrok-Kal, Tahu briefly considers using the Vahi to stop it, but he doesn't because he realizes that in his current mental state, he would never be able to control it. He knows he's not in control of himself. Just moments earlier in the fight, he almost committed suicide out of spite because he hated the idea of retreating and letting the Bohrok-Kal win again. In the end, he does retreat, lamenting his temper and asking himself why Vakama would trust him with this burden. See, this instance really highlights one of the more interesting aspects of Tahu's character, which is that, despite his hot-headed impulsivity, Tahu is actually an incredibly introspective and self-aware character. He has anger issues, and he is fully aware that his anger is an issue. When he does finally use the mask in the last moments before the call would free the Bohrok, he does so out of recognition that this is the only option left, and that they have nothing left to lose. Tahu accepts this power with humility and out of a sense of duty, and this absence of arrogance gives him the willpower to hold back time on the Bohrok-Kal, stopping them from freeing the Bohrok. Tahu finally managed to control himself, and so was worthy to control this power. It's also very interesting that the Mask of Time, despite its awesome power, did not end up being the actual solution. However, it did give the Toa the time they needed to find another way, one that relied upon their willpower, their unity, and the lessons they learned about the price of power. The Toa win in the end by collectively gathering their willpower and pouring it into their symbols, still held by the Bohrok-Kal. That act causes the symbols to activate and give their energy to the Bohrok-Kal, massively increasing the Kal's powers to new heights. The Kal then hesitate moments before they would have unlocked the Nuva Cube, reveling in their new strength and entertaining fantasies of ruling alongside the Bohrok and cleansing Motunui without the swarms. While indulging those arrogant daydreams, they didn't notice until it was too late that the symbols had fed them more power than they could control. Their own abilities ran wild, and they each self-destructed, victims of their own power and hubris. In essence, the Kal reacted to their new powers the same way the Tohunuva did theirs, and in both cases, it led to their downfall. I remember thinking as a kid that this resolution felt weird, as it kinda came out of nowhere from a lore perspective. I remember hoping that the Exotoa or the Mask of Time would be the solutions on their own. But now that I'm older, I see that this ending was appropriate thematically. There was no power-up that could solve this problem, and there shouldn't have been. That would completely undermine the point the story was trying to make. The Toa had to learn to truly understand that their true power comes from within them, from the power of their minds and the power of their unity. And it's fitting that they learn to solve the problem by primarily using those, without any special abilities. They understood the lesson that too much power, without the responsibility to control it right, was a bad thing, and they used that hard-earned wisdom to defeat the Kal. This arc, and its exploration into the themes of power, were really important to the story Bionicle was trying to tell. Bionicle had an incredibly fast-paced plot, and tons of lore and mythos to cover, meaning slower arcs centered around the characters were much rarer than in other series. This arc provided just that, a chance to really dive into the characters' minds and explore what it means to be a hero. While it doesn't fully resolve all their character flaws, this arc pushed the Toa to make progress in becoming the kinds of heroes they needed to be, and sets them up nicely for the character arcs they'd undergo in the Mask of Light movie and beyond. After all, understanding that cleverness and unity matter more than raw strength was a major key to them being able to survive and even win against the supremely powerful Brotherhood of Makuta during the Cardanui arc later on. And so we see that the Bohrok-Kal Arc, while somewhat underappreciated, was a truly important and worthy addition to the Bionicle mythos. But what do you guys think? Do you enjoy how this arc explored the trope of losing power? And do you have your own thoughts on how it went? Let's keep the discussion going. This has been Hirora Nuva, wishing you a happy Bionicle Day, everybody, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care, my gathered friends.